On May 23, 1846, the so-called Adam and Eve cylinder sill entered the British Museum dating to roughly 2200 to 2100 BC. One glance at the sill, you could see why this could be a shocking piece of evidence of Adam and Eve from 4,200 years ago. You see, the sacred tree in the center with fruit hanging on both ends. The person on the left was identified with a woman putting their hair up in a bun, holding out her left hand as she sits facing a god-man. He's identified that way by his horned headdress, who holds out his right hand. Both wear plain robes and sit on either side of a date palm tree. Behind both of them is a wavy-looking serpent, rising vertically. Both male and female seem to be reaching toward the tree in an act of temptation to eat from the juicy fruit. The tree, serpent, and figures carved on this greenstone cylinder sill suggested to George Smith, an Assyriologist working in the British Museum between 1840 and 1876, that the scene was related to the Old Testament story of the temptation of Eve in the Garden of Eden. Honestly, it doesn't take much imagination to see why. You have two figures facing a fruit tree with serpents in the picture reaching for the fruit. How common are these kinds of cylinders, or images for that matter? Well, according to most scholars, it's pretty common. You see, Smith saw the Adam and Eve temptation scene in this sill. However, scholars today point out, in fact, it is one of a well-known class of fertility or ritual banquet images, rather than narrative temptation scenes. Before we rub our hands together as though Smith is just completely wrong, you have to understand that Smith is suggesting this cylinder sill is depicting the temptation as we find it in Genesis, meaning the Adam and Eve story is likely directly borrowing from this sill. George Smith said this: "One striking and important specimen has two figures sitting one on each side of a tree, holding out their hands to the fruit, while at the back of one is stretched a serpent. We know well that in these early sculptures, none of these figures were chance devices, but all represented events or supposed events and figures in their legends. Thus, it is evident that a form of the story of the fall, similar to that of Genesis, was known in early times in Babylonia." That idea caught on. Frederick Delitzsch even asked in his famous lecture, Babel and Bible, "May I lift the veil? May I point to an old Babylonian cylinder sill? It is not the very acme of likelihood that there is some connection between this old Babylonian picture and the biblical tale of the fall of man." J. N. Freidenberg went further in his 1886 book, summarizing exactly what you see on the sill. Upon this cylinder is represented a tree with 4 and 5 nearly horizontal branches on either side, the two lowest branches bearing each a large bunch of fruit. A man wearing a Babylonian turban sits on one side of the tree, and a woman sits on the other side. They stretch out their hands as if to pluck the fruit. Behind the woman, a serpent stands upreared. He concludes, "This illustrates the story of Genesis and admits of no other satisfactory explanation." However, today experts agree that those 19th century readings go too far. Freidenberg was comparing the sill only with the Bible's story, ignoring the fact that cylinder sill art follows its own conventions, made centuries after the old Babylonian period. Modern scholars like Dominique Collin look at this sill in context, its style, date, post-Akkadian, circa 2192 to 2004 BCE, and other examples from the same era, and show it's not really an Adam and Eve scene after all. Well, that settles it, friends. Nothing left here to see, right? Actually, no. While scholars have found Smith and his contemporaries to go a bit too far with these observations, as if this ancient sill practically told the fall of mankind much earlier in legendary form, we can still see the common A&E, ancient Near Eastern, myth symbolism. This post-Akkadian Sil, created in the era immediately after the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, circa 2334 to 2154 BCE, isn't depicting a single myth, but a collection of various symbols that appear in several different myths. If it is reflecting a single myth, we don't have that story preserved. What the scholars are saying is that this Sil isn't depicting a fall of mankind. This should be obvious because the Bible is clearly reworking these older stories and mythic tropes. So while the story plays out differently, the elements are very similar. That is what the Bible is known for, often twisting the earlier positive motifs from Mesopotamia into negative ones. Scholars today view the famous Adam and Eve Sil as part of a broader Mesopotamian tradition of images and stories that celebrate life, fertility, and divine communion, rather than a one-to-one portrait of a lost Eden myth. For example, in Inanna and the Hulupu tree, circa 2100 BCE, the goddess plants a sacred tree that a serpent coils around until Gilgamesh clears it so she can craft throne and bed from its wood. In the Sumerian hymn Inanna and Utu contains an etiological myth describing how Inanna became the goddess of sex. At the beginning of the hymn, Inanna knows nothing of sex, so she begs her brother Utu to take her to Kur. Kur is the Sumerian underworld, so that she may taste the fruit of a tree that grows there, which will reveal to her all the secrets of sex. Utu complies, and in Kur, the underworld, Inanna tastes the tree, or the fruit, and becomes knowledgeable. The hymn employs the same motif found in the myth of Enki and Ninhursag, and in the later biblical story of Adam and Eve. Notice on the Sil, it's depicting a male deity on the right, wearing his horned crown, which was preserved for gods and not mortals. However, we do find the king Naram Sin of Akkad, Sargon's grandson, ruled at the height of the Akkadian Empire, generally dated to circa 2255 to 2218 BCE, what scholars call Middle Chronology. It was this king who famously broke Mesopotamian convention by donning the double-horned crown as a living ruler, as seen in his victory stele, and claiming divine status for himself. Naram Sin didn't just declare himself a god, he also made his grandfather Sargon and his father Manishtushu into gods after they died. This was unusual at the time, but here's something to think about. Naram Sin ruled at the very end of the old Akkadian period, just when these banquet scenes were starting to be created. Both Naram Sin's empire and the later III kingdom share the same heartland of southern Mesopotamia. So the Sil emerges in the very region he once ruled. We have chronological overlap and geographical overlap with this god-man-king and these banquet scenes. Is there any connection? Food for thought. We need to understand historically, this act of self-deification by this king was viewed as crossing the boundary between mortal and divine. Although no contemporary royal inscription condemns Naram Sin's divine claim, within a century or two, Mesopotamian Naru historiographic literature portrays his self-deification as an act of hubris that brought divine wrath. Naru literature is ancient Mesopotamia's version of historical fiction. Scribes wrote autobiographical royal inscriptions in the first person, I, Naram Sin, but freely woven epic dialogue, divine interventions, and symbolic episodes. These texts use real kings and events to teach moral or religious lessons, warning against pride, celebrating piety, or justifying a ruler's power, while blurring the line between fact and fiction. Think of them as political propaganda and myth rolled into one dramatic, larger-than-life narrative. It was right around the time that this Adam and Eve seal was made that tales circulated about the fall and hubris of Naram Sin. One such writing is the Curse of Akkad, 2047 to 1750 BCE, depicts Enlil withdrawing his favor from Akkad because of Naram Sin's impiety, most explicitly his plundering of Enlil's Ikher temple, and then laying waste to the empire. The poem frames his downfall as divine punishment for overstepping his mortal station, implicitly including his assumption of godhood among the offenses. Another example is the Great Revolt against Naram Sin, and Naram Sin and the enemy hordes continue this theme, presenting his claim to divinity as the reason for both human rebellion and cosmic revenge, reinforcing a cautionary message about the proper limits of kingship. Naram Sin and the enemy horde survives not only in the Old Babylonian copies around 1800 to 1600 BCE, but was recopied in Middle and Standard Neo-Babylonian editions, 7th to 6th century BCE, precisely on the eve of Persian rule, showing that his story remained part of the literary and moral curriculum of Babylonian scribes. In fact, this is around the time that Jews become scribes within the Persian Empire and learn the Babylonian writings as well, and in that process easily would have been aware of such propaganda. When the Persians took over, kings like Cyrus and Darius took care not to claim literal godhood. Achaemenid royal inscriptions emphasize that the king is chosen by or hears Ahura Mazda, but never that he is a god, reinforcing the long-standing boundary that Naram Sin famously crossed and the cautionary example his downfall provided. I know of another story written around the fall of Babylon, or likely into the Persian and Hellenistic period, where mortals attempt to cross the boundaries of mortality into divinity. Adam and Eve do just this. That is not to say that Genesis necessarily borrowed directly from the Naram Sin legends, or the Adam and Eve seal. Not only is Adam and Eve seen at fault for trying to be like gods, but we find this hubris with the Tower of Babel. In ancient Mesopotamia, kingship was more than political power. It was a sacred office filled with divine responsibility to maintain life and fertility. One of the king's sacral titles was literally gardener. In Sumerian, Nugi. Akkadian, Nukaribu. Far from being humble, this title indicated the king's role in tending the cosmic garden of the gods. Theo Wittengren, a comparative religion scholar, noted that Mesopotamian kings were seen as caretakers of the tree of life, effectively gardeners of the temple's sacred grove. In a way, the king's palace and temple were microcosms of Eden, where the king fulfills the functions of a gardener of the temple grove where this cultic tree is planted. One fascinating example comes from the legend of Sargon of Akkad in 2330 BCE. Sargon's rise to kingship is wrapped in gardening imagery, but also holds a key to the later Moses story, and one might say Jesus. Let's read the entire legend. Sargon, the mighty king, king of Akkad am I. My mother was lowly, my father I did not know. The brother of my father dwelt in the mountain. My city is Assuparanu, which is situated on the bank of the Puratu Euphrates. My lowly mother conceived me. In secret, she brought me forth. She placed me in a basket of reeds. She closed my entrance with bitumen. She cast me upon the rivers, which did not overflow me. The river carried me. It brought me to Aki, the irrigator. Aki, the irrigator, in the goodness of his heart, lifted me out. Aki, the irrigator, as his own son, brought me up. Aki the irrigator as his gardener appointed me. When I was a gardener, the goddess of Ishtar loved me, and for 4 years I ruled the kingdom. The black-headed peoples I ruled, I governed. Mighty mountains with axes of bronze I destroyed. I ascended the upper mountains. I burst through the lower mountains. The country of the sea I besieged 3 times. Dilmun I captured. Unto the great Dur-Ilu I went up. I altered. Whatsoever king shall be exalted after me, let him rule, let him govern the black-headed peoples. Mighty mountains with axes of bronze let him destroy. Let him ascend the upper mountains, let him break through the lower mountains. Let the country of the sea, let him besiege 3 times. Dilmun, let him capture. To great Dur-Ilu, let him go up. Here, the future king is literally a gardener by profession, beloved by the goddess Ishtar. In Mesopotamian thought, this was no coincidence. Royalty and horticulture were symbolically linked. Tending the garden meant cultivating the well-being of the land and people. Divine favor, Ishtar's love, followed the true gardener king, legitimizing his rule. Ancient art echoes this connection. Assyrian palace reliefs often show the king performing rituals in front of a stylized sacred tree, flanked by winged guardian figures. In one famous panel from King Ashurbanipal II's palace, 9th century BCE, the king stands reverently before a tall, symmetry-perfect tree, protected by 2 winged genies above and beside him. He holds a bucket and cone, implements for sprinkling holy water and pollen, essentially watering and pollinating the sacred tree to ensure its vitality. These genies have pine cones and bucket-shaped vessels, representing fertilization of the date palm, a tree held sacred by the Assyrians because it provides food, drink, wood, and prosperity. The king, dressed in ritual robes with his mace of authority, stands in the role of head gardener, ensuring the tree, and by extension, the kingdom, thrives. Even mythic primeval rulers were cast as gardeners. The 7 antediluvian sages, called Apsû of Mesopotamian lore, often depicted as fish-cloaked or eagle-headed beings, were believed to have brought civilization its arts, including agriculture and gardening. They too were associated with the Apsû of Eridu, the subterranean sweet waters, and sometimes appear holding a sprinkling device to water the sacred tree. In art, a human-headed genie watering a sacred tree personifies the idea that divine guardians continually irrigate the tree of life. The king, as chief priest, took on this duty during rituals. In fact, one Sumerian hymn praises King Sulgi of Ur, who reigned in 2094 to 2047 BCE, for ensuring abundant growth. It describes him as one who makes the seed of the city sprout forth, clear agricultural language used to glorify a ruler. The Bible preserves this concept of a divinely appointed gardener in the figure of Adam. In Genesis, God places Adam in the garden to till it and keep it, Genesis 2:15, essentially assigning him the role of gardener priest of Eden, one might say king. This mirrors the Mesopotamian idea of the first king, or first man, as the Ganunu, gardener, who serves the gods by caring for the sacred ground. The parallel deepens when we consider that in some Mesopotamian texts, the high priest of the temple was called Isi Akil, literally man of the watering can, meaning irrigator. Adam, working the garden soil, is a prototype of the ideal king who secures divine blessing through cultivation. Long before Genesis, Mesopotamians imagined a magical tree that granted eternal life, fed by a spring of living water. In their oldest stories, the tree of life and the water of life stand together in a garden-like paradise. One well-known Sumerian Akkadian hymn even paints Eridu, the very first city and home of the god Enki, as a sacred oasis where that life-bestowing tree and its nourishing waters flourish side by side. In Eridu, there is a black kiskanu tree, growing in a pure place. Its appearance is lapis lazuli, erected on the Apsû. Enki, when walking there, filleth Eridu with abundance. In its holy temple, there is a grove casting its shadow. Therein, no man enters. In the midst are the sun god and the sovereign of heaven. In between flows the river with the two mouths. This stunning scene predates Genesis by at least 1,000 years. It portrays a sanctuary garden, a lustrous kiskanu tree, an evergreen associated with Enki's temple, stands beside the Apsû, the subterranean freshwater ocean, source of all life. Enki, called Ea in Akkadian, strolls in this paradise, and wherever he steps, abundance follows. The text even specifies that at the center of this sacred grove flows streams of life, the river with the two mouths, likely referring to the two great rivers, Tigris and Euphrates. This ancient paradise bears an obvious resemblance to Eden, where a river-like watered the garden and split into headwaters of the world's rivers. The Eridu myth makes explicit what Genesis implies. The tree of life grows beside living waters. The tree of life in Sumero-Akkadian belief was not a normal tree, but a cult object, often a stylized pole or plant adorned with precious metals and ribbons. As scholar Sidney Smith observed, this tree is not a real one, but a cult tree, a trunk decorated with metal bands and fillets. It represented the presence of a deity and the promise of renewed life. Look at this description of a magical plant in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Garden of the Gods episode. Carnelian it bears as its fruit. Vine grapes hang from it, sweet to behold. Lapis lazuli is its foliage. Fruit it bears, wonderful to gaze upon. These jeweled fruits recall the precious stones that adorned Eden. Genesis 2:12 mentions gold and onyx in the land. Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, desperately sought this plant of life to cure his mortality. After many adventures, Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian flood hero, reveals its secret location. There is a plant. Its name is Old Man Young. With it, a man can regain his vigor. Gilgamesh dives to the ocean depths and retrieves this prickly plant, hoping to restore youth. However, in a twist of fate, a serpent snatches the plant while Gilgamesh bathes, and at once it sloughed its skin. Rejuvenated by the stolen life-giving plant, Gilgamesh is left bereft, having lost immortality to a serpent, just as Adam and Eve lost access to life's fruit after the serpent's deception. The parallel is remarkable. In both stories, a serpent is associated with humanity's failure to obtain eternal life. Another Mesopotamian tale, the myth of Adapa, provides a mirror image to Eden's forbidden fruit. Adapa, whom some compare to Adam linguistically, was a wise human who angered the sky god Anu. When Adapa is summoned to heaven to answer for his misdeed, his patron god Enki warns him, "You will be offered the food of life and water of life. Do not eat or drink, for they are a deadly lie." Obedient Adapa refuses the food and water in Anu's court. Only after he's sent away does he learn the tragic truth. The offerings were genuine food and water of life that would have made him immortal. As one tablet laments, the food of life they placed before him, but he did not eat. The water of life they placed before him, but he did not drink. By following bad advice, Adapa, like Adam, missed his chance at eternal life. In Eden, it was eating the wrong fruit that led to death. For Adapa, not eating the right food sealed his mortal fate. Both narratives underline that divine immortality was a gift withheld, leaving humans in our own familiar state. Albert T. Clay in 1923 first noted the linguistic similarity, Adapa versus Adam, the shared motif of a wise man summoned before a sky god and offered divine food that he must reject. More recently, Seth L. Sanders in 2017 has examined how the test and punishment motif in Adapa's tale, Wise Human Angering Anu, was recast in Israelite tradition as the story of Adam and Eve. The water of life was as crucial as the tree or plant of life. Mesopotamian art frequently shows gods or kings holding a vase with streams of water gushing forth, often in twin jets flanking a figure. One iconic image is the so-called Ada sill, circa 2300 BCE, a cylinder sill that depicts multiple Mesopotamian deities. At the far right stands Enki, identifiable by the two streams of water flowing from his shoulders, with fish swimming in them. This visual literally portrays Enki as the source of the life-giving rivers. In the same scene, other gods are present, including Ishtar with weapons and possibly holding a plant, and the sun god rising. But Enki's flowing water of life is extremely obvious. In ritual texts, kings are said to physically handle these symbols of life. In a hymn to King Ninurta, circa 19th century BCE, it's proclaimed the king's duty is to keep open the holy mouth of Tigris and Euphrates, meaning he must ensure the rivers flow freely, irrigating the land. This is metaphorical language for maintaining the water of life for his realm. Similarly, a praise poem for King Sulgi encourages him to pour water of life on the sacred date palm, an allusion to nurturing the tree of life. Wittengren notes, the tree of life constantly needs the water of life near at hand. The king pours out the water of life over the tree of life. We can imagine a New Year's festival in Nippur or Babylon where the king ceremonially watered a young date palm in the temple courtyard, enacting the myth of reviving the dying god, often identified with Tammuz, the vegetation deity. Indeed, Tammuz, Sumerian Dumuzi, beloved of Ishtar, was equated with the life-giving flora, at times called a cedar or sapling, and revived from death by divine water and plant of life in myth. One text of Inanna's descent has Inanna cry, "Who knows the plant of life? Who knows the water of life? He will surely bring me back to life." And at the climax, 60 times the plant of life, 60 times the water of life apply to her. Inanna will rise. Here, the goddess is resurrected with those very elixirs, a powerful ritual idea that life or even resurrection comes from combining the sacred plant and water. The Bible picks up these ancient themes in subtle ways. The Garden of Eden is described as containing both the tree of life and a spring that divides into 4 rivers, reminiscent of Mesopotamian paradise imagery. After Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit, God remarks that they might reach out and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever, showing the tree's fruit was understood as conferring immortality, just as the Samu balâti, or plant of life, would have done for Gilgamesh or Adapa. The cherubim placed to guard Eden's tree in Genesis 3:24 make us reminded of the protective genies flanking the sacred tree in the Assyrian art. In fact, later Jewish tradition imagined these cherubim watering the garden from a celestial river. And whereas Mesopotamian kings claimed to channel the Euphrates and Tigris for life, Israel's prophets looked forward to a day when divine water would stream out from the temple in Jerusalem. Ezekiel, in a vision, sees a river gushing from the temple threshold, turning the desert into a lush garden. Trees for food grow on both banks. Their fruit will be for food and their leaves for healing. Ezekiel 47:12. The parallel to Eden and to Eridu's grove is unmistakable. Water plus tree equals life for humanity. We will revisit Ezekiel later, but by the time of the Bible, the ancient motif of the tree and water of life was well ingrained in the religious imagination. Across the ancient Near East, the sacred tree was a potent symbol of cosmic order and dynastic vitality, and it became entwined with royal ideology. We've seen the king as gardener. Paradoxically, kings were also likened to the tree of life itself. In Mesopotamia, a reigning king could be poetically described as a great tree, providing shelter, nourishment, and divine connection between heaven and earth, much like the concept of the axis mundi, the cosmic pillar. This idea finds dramatic expression in the Bible in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel 4:10-17. The Babylonian king dreams of a giant tree reaching the sky, under which beasts find shade and birds nest in its branches, a metaphor for his vast rule. A holy watcher decrees the tree be cut down, symbolizing Nebuchadnezzar's temporary downfall. Crucially, the dream refers to the stump bound with iron, hinting that the tree, the king, will sprout again. The imagery is pure ancient Near Eastern. The king is the cosmic world tree, cut and restored by divine will. The story in Daniel, set in Babylon, likely drew on Babylon's own royal mythology about sacred trees and kingship. Mesopotamian inscriptions and art often connect rulers to specific holy trees or plants. For instance, at the Temple of Ninhursag in Dilmun, Bahrain thought to be a paradise land, one text called the king the palm in the Garden of Delights. Some Assyrian kings took titles such as Sprout of All Peoples, or Nourisher of the Orchard of Humanity. In a Babylonian ritual, the king at coronation might be handed a branch or scepter that is explicitly called Hasur, cedar, or Sinu, branch, effectively treating the king's authority as a branch from the tree of life. We read in Wittengren's research that the king carries in his hand a twig from the tree of life. And even more, that certain text portrays the king as a tree, a Tammuz-like deity standing or planted in the sanctuary of Apsû. In these cases, the king was seen as the personification of the life force that the sacred tree embodied. Little wonder that royal scepters in Israel were sometimes made of wood from fruit-bearing vines or trees. Ezekiel 19 famously compares the fallen princes of Judah to a once luxuriant vine, planted by waters, with strong branches fit for rulers' scepters, now plucked up and withered in the desert. Here, the mother vine symbolizes the Davidic dynasty, and her branches, princes, were meant to be scepters of rule. The allegory presumes the same link Wittengren noted. A king's scepter equals a branch of the tree of life. The figure of Tammuz, Tamuzi, reinforces the king-tree connection. Tammuz was the young lover of Ishtar, a shepherd god associated with seasonal fertility, essentially a dying and rising vegetation god. Sumerian songs invoke Tammuz as various plants. You are an apple tree laden with fruit, a cedar among spruces, etc. In one liturgy, Tammuz is called the cedar in the holy garden. When he dies each summer, vegetation withers. When he revives through Ishtar's weeping and sprinkling of water, greenery returns. This cycle was ritually enacted, often with the king playing the role of Tammuz in sacred marriage rites, ensuring the land's fertility or fruitfulness. An ancient Babylonian ritual, attested by Herodotus and others, involved the king marrying a goddess's high priestess in a bedchamber amid gardens, a ceremony to renew the earth's life. The king in that moment is Dumuzi, the planted tree of life, united with the goddess of fertility. It's impressive that Ezekiel 8:14 describes women at the Jerusalem temple weeping for Tammuz, showing that even in the 6th century BCE Judah, the cultic memory of the dying vegetation god persisted. Israelite prophets railed against such foreign rituals, but ironically, the imagery of resurrection and life that Tammuz embodied seeped into biblical hope for resurrection and restored abundance. It's also worth noting that the story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38 reflects this ancient Sumerian sacred marriage motif. In the story, Judah's daughter-in-law Tamar disguises herself as a prostitute to trick Judah into sleeping with her, so she can bear a child from his seed, his line, after he fails to provide a levirate marriage. She succeeds, becomes pregnant with twins, Perez and Zerah, and is declared more righteous than Judah. Her name Tamar literally means palm tree, specifically the date palm. The date palm was known as the tree of life, effectively a fertility symbol. The date palm is linked to sacred marriage hymns where the woman is the tree and the man, often Dumuzi, is the gardener or farmer planting the seed. These scenes are often sexual, and this is the case for both Tamars in the Bible. Scholars have long noted the connections between Judah's Tamar of Genesis 38 and King David's daughter Tamar in 2 Samuel 13. However, these Tamars reflect an even older mythology with Ishtar, also known as Inanna. Both Tamar and Ishtar are beautiful and are pursued by lovers. After Inanna has sexual union with her lover, she experiences a descent into the underworld which resulted in death. As Judah's Tamar was going to be put to death, but was spared for her righteousness, and David's Tamar was avenged by Absalom, avenging her and murdering Amnon 2 years later. Another vivid example of the king tree motif is found in an Ugaritic text from ancient Canaan, 14th century BCE. King Kerit is blessed that his offspring will be like a luxuriant tree in the sanctuary. In Egypt, likewise, pharaohs were depicted as nourished by the holy sycamore tree, often personified as a goddess pouring water to the king. Across cultures, the message was the same. Legitimate kingship is life-giving, a tree planted by divine hands. The Bible's ideal king is described similarly. He shall be like a tree planted by water, that yields fruit in its season. Psalm 1:3, originally about the righteous man, later applied to the king. And the messianic oracle of Isaiah 11:1 declares, "A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots." The future Savior is envisioned as a branch from the Davidic line, echoing the ancient notion of kings as living branches of the cosmic tree. Consider also how the tree of life symbol itself might have been worn or held by kings. Cylinder sills from Mesopotamia occasionally show a king holding a staff with a flower or cone, possibly a stylized tree of life symbol, while approaching a deity. In one Neo-Assyrian letter, the writers use a telling phrase when thanking the king. "We were like dead dogs, but the Lord, the king, gave us to eat from the tree of life and drink the water of life. This metaphor implies the king dispensed life to his subjects, perhaps by clemency or favor, phrased in mythic terms. It's as if the king carried the fruits of the tree of life to revive those as good as dead. The early Christian imagination later transfers this imagery to Christ. More on that soon. Ancient Near Eastern religion was not just myth, it was ritual. Many of these ideas about sacred trees and life-giving waters were performed in temple contexts. Temples often had actual gardens or groves attached. In Mesopotamia, the inner sanctuary might house a small sacred tree or a representation of it. For instance, Enki's temple in Eridu was said to have a grove within the holy temple, casting its shadow. The Babylonian Esagila temple of Marduk reportedly had a cherished kiskanu tree growing beside the ritual basin, commemorating the original tree of life at creation. As Wittengren remarks, the connection between water and tree, between temple basin and sacred grove, recurs also in Palestine. Early Israelites, like their neighbors, venerated God at sites featuring a well or spring and a tree. Genesis 21:33 describes Abraham planting a tamarisk tree by a well at Beersheba and calling on God there, essentially establishing a cult site with tree and water. Many of Israel's patriarchal traditions, the Oak of Mamre, the terebinth at Shechem, mention sacred trees at places of worship. This isn't idolatry. It's the cultural norm of invoking the life giver at life's natural symbols. When Solomon built the Jerusalem temple around 960 BCE, he incorporated this symbolism. The temple featured the molten sea, a huge bronze basin of water, in its courtyard, and was decorated inside with carved gourds, flowers, and palm trees. 1 Kings 7:23-26, 1 Kings 6:18 and 29. According to later tradition, a spring, the Gihon, flowed near the Temple Mount, possibly tapped or channeled to supply the temple, fulfilling the ideal of a source in the sanctuary. Indeed, Psalm 46:4 celebrates there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High, which many think refers to the sacred waters blessing Zion. In the temple's inner decor, golden menorahs, lampstands, stood as stylized trees with branches and flower cup shapes, a likely echo of the tree of life, providing light and life before God. We also find later Jewish texts like Zechariah 14:8 and Joel 3:18 prophesying that living water shall flow out of Jerusalem on the day of the Lord, and trees will grow on either side, directly paralleling Ezekiel's vision and harking back to the Mesopotamian paradise motif. In cultic rituals, water libations were key. At Babylon's New Year's festival, the king would pour out water in honor of Marduk to symbolize the replenishing of cosmic order. Hittite and Ugaritic rituals mention pouring water and wine at a tree shrine or garden pavilion for the gods. A Ugaritic text speaks of a ritual garden where a sacrifice was offered near a spring under a flourishing tree, invoking the blessing of gods. In Israel's Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, a joyous water libation ceremony developed in the Second Temple times, where priests poured water down from the Siloam spring onto the altar, praying for rains and fertility for the new year. Although this is post-biblical, its spirit aligns with the ancient recognition that water equals life, given liturgically to God for the sustenance of creation. one cannot overlook the sacred marriage rite. In Sumer and Babylon, the New Year spring was marked by the Eros Gamos, a ritual wherein the king playing Tammuz and the high priestess playing Inanna, Ishtar, consummated a union to guarantee agricultural abundance. These rites took place in richly decorated bedchambers, often in a temple garden or atop a ziggurat with lush greenery. Herodotus wrote that at Babylon, a single woman, the priestess of Ishtar, stayed overnight in the inner shrine to consort with the god, a memory of the old rite. The logic was sympathetic magic. The human couple's union under blessing of the gods would prompt the land, the garden of the king, to blossom with grain, fruit, and new flocks. The king, as Tammuz, was essentially impregnating the earth with life. This resonates with the Eden story in a curious way. Adam and Eve's union in the garden was meant to be fruitful and multiply, Genesis 1:28, a command with not just population in mind, but perhaps suggesting that human procreation was part of maintaining the created order's fertility. Sympathetic magic is the idea that you can influence something in the real world by using objects that look like it or were once connected to it, kind of like magic through resemblance or connection. There are two types: imitative magic, like affects like. For example, making a doll that looks like a person and poking it to try to hurt that person, like a voodoo doll. The idea is, if it looks like them, it will affect them. And then there's contagious magic. Once connected, always connected. An example of that would be using someone's hair or nail clippings in a spell because it was once part of their body. The belief is, if it came from them, it still has power over them. So basically, sympathetic magic is based on copying or connecting to something in order to control it, like using a photo of rain in a ritual to bring real rain. It's a really old idea found in many cultures, and even though we now see it as superstition, some modern traditions and even advertising and branding still use symbolic thinking in a similar way. On some cylinder sills, we see a worshiper or a minor god pouring a liquid, water of life-giving potion onto a figure that appears as a stylized tree, or even onto another deity symbolizing vegetation. One sill from the old Babylonian period shows two human figures standing on either side of a small tree or plant. One figure pours water from a vessel at its base, while the other raises a cup, perhaps a ritual of offering the water of life to the tree of life. Another sill from Assyria in the 9th century BCE in the Walters Art Museum features winged guardians flanking a sacred tree, with one griffin-like feature nibbling the tree's top and another creature below, possibly an allegory of fertilization or the cycle of pruning and growth. In fact, ivory carvings from the Phoenician coast, 8th century BCE, often show fantastic animals like griffins or sphinxes attending a sacred tree, emphasizing that even in decorative art, the tree symbolized agricultural abundance and nourishment. These pieces likely adorned furniture in palaces or temples, silently reinforcing the king's duty to uphold fertility, each king a guardian of the garden. When you take a step back, it becomes clear that the Jerusalem temple was designed to echo the Garden of Eden, a sacred place where God and humans could meet, surrounded by symbols of trees and flowing water. Jewish tradition later explicitly described the temple as Eden restored. The Holy of Holies was the divine garden, with cherubim like those in Eden's gate. The temple veil had a woven pattern of palm trees and flowers, and the menorah stood for the tree of life. Even a midrash claims the Gihon spring that watered Eden, Genesis 2:13, emerged from under the Temple Mount. While not in the Bible text, This shows how natural the association was. Geo Wittengren notes, "In Solomon's temple, we meet both a source in the sanctuary and a creek outside it, as well as an artificial basin. In addition, we have many allusions to trees growing within the sanctuary area. In these cases, there could be no doubt that both trees and water are associated with the idea of life." He then draws the line straight to the New Testament's final vision. No wonder then that in Revelation 22:2, the river and the tree growing by the river are called water of life and tree of life. Here we meet exactly the same idea as in Mesopotamia. The water of life and the tree of life are found within the precincts of the divine temple. Take a look at the Warka vase from ancient Uruk around 3000 BCE, over 5,000 years old. Its relief bands depict a lush procession, water and barley at the bottom register, a line of animals in the middle, and at the top, men carrying offerings to the goddess Inanna in front of two tall reed bundles, stylized trees. This ritual scene marries water, vegetation, and divine blessing, essentially a sacred marriage or harvest offering in a temple garden. With this in mind, look at this image of a model of Solomon's temple interior, pointing out palm motifs and the sea basin. Then, a quick glimpse of a Jewish Sukkot water libation reenactment to tie ancient practice to later tradition. Having explored these ancient motifs, we arrive back at the Bible, which now appears in a new light, not as an isolated island of ideas, but as part of a continuum of Near Eastern thought. The authors of Genesis and Revelation inherited a rich symbolic language and adapted it to their unique theological vision. Let's draw the connections clearly. The Garden of Eden in Genesis 2-3 is a lush garden in the east, planted by God, with every fruitful tree, and in the middle, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. A river flows from Eden, splitting into four mighty rivers. This scene is a deliberate echo of Mesopotamian paradise geography, like Dilmun or Eridu, where divine gardens had life-giving water and special plants. The presence of a crafty serpent in Eden recalls the myriad serpent or dragon guardians in ancient Near Eastern myths. For instance, a snake often symbolized fertility and wisdom, as on the Adam and Eve sill. As Joseph Campbell observed, the Mesopotamian garden motif was one of innocence and natural abundance, where the fruits of immortality and wisdom were accessible. The Genesis story can be seen as turning that motif into a moral drama. Humanity, by transgressing divine command, loses the free gift of eternal life that the tree could provide. Yet the very need for a tree of life in the tale betrays reliance on earlier conceptions. Scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer long ago noted Sumerian paradise myths like Enki and Ninhursag in Dilmun as precursors to Eden. And indeed, Dilmun was described as a place bright, pure, where the lion and sick lion were not, where no one said, "I am ill," where death was absent. Language very much like Eden's perfection. When Genesis says, God planted a garden, and there he put the man, Genesis 2:8, one hears echoes of Mesopotamian gods putting kings in a holy garden to tend it. Adam is effectively the first priest king, the archetypal gardener, charged with a role identical to what Sumerian kings strove for: to guard the divinely planted tree and partake of flowing waters, except that Adam failed and is exiled. Cherubim and guardians are another clue, as Genesis 3:24's cherubim with a fiery sword blocking the way to the tree of life may reflect memories of those winged genies and fierce griffins flanking sacred trees on every palace wall. The concept of supernatural gatekeepers of paradise was widespread. For example, in the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, when Gilgamesh reaches the Garden of the Gods, he must pass guardian scorpion beings at Mount Mashu, and later, a divine barmaid named Siduri keeps the gate of Dilmun's paradise sure. Similarly, Eden's cherubim ensure that fallen humans cannot snatch immortality illicitly. It's as if the Bible is saying that old Mesopotamian dream of a hero finding his way back to the Garden of the Gods, Gilgamesh's quest, it's barred to humankind due to our disobedience. In effect, the biblical authors moralized the ancient myth, emphasizing moral exclusive Yahwism over magical access to life. Then there's sacred trees in Israel. While Israel's official religion forbade idolizing trees, the prophets rail against Asherim poles and sacred groves, the symbolism of the sacred tree was absorbed into Yahwistic context. The prophet Ezekiel, who notably lived in Babylonian exile, employs a well-known Mesopotamian metaphor when comparing the mighty empires to trees in Eden. In Ezekiel 31, he says of Assyria, and by analogy Egypt, Assyria was a cedar in Lebanon with beautiful branches and for shade. The cedars in God's garden could not rival it. All the trees of Eden envied it. Ezekiel 31:3, 8-9. Here, Eden is invoked as a cosmic forest where the greatest worldly kingdoms are but trees planted by God, and God can cut them down. This shows the Hebrew prophet had fully incorporated the world tree motif, not to glorify a king, but to warn him. The prideful cedar, Pharaoh, will be felled and sent to the underworld, lying among the other fallen trees of Eden. The imagery makes sense only in light of the broader Near Eastern idea that kings and nations are like cosmic trees, a concept Ezekiel's audience, familiar with such lore, would grasp. Revelation's New Jerusalem also comes to mind with Revelation 22. The final book of the Bible completes the circle. John of Patmos offers a vision of the world to come using the most ancient of symbols. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the great street. On either side of the river grew the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Revelation 22, 1-2. This is practically a direct translation of Ezekiel's prophecy in Ezekiel 47:12 into the idiom of Christian hope. It explicitly names the elements we've discussed, the water of life and the tree of life, now situated in the heart of the holy city, essentially turning Jerusalem into Eden restored. As Wittengren noted, Revelation merely reaffirms the ancient Near Eastern template. The divine throne temple has water of life flowing out, and a tree of life grows beside it, giving immortality and healing. The only twist is the presence of the Lamb, Christ, as co-occupant of the throne, a theological statement that Christ is the source of life alongside God. We also see a powerful image of Jesus Christ, the gardener king. Early Christians, steeped in Jewish tradition, extended these symbols to Jesus. In the Gospel of John, when Mary Magdalene encounters the risen Christ, she supposes him to be the gardener. This powerful detail, John 20:15, may be more than a narrative happenstance. Symbolically, John portrays Jesus as a new Adam, or the ultimate gardener, tending God's new creation. After all, if the resurrection inaugurates a new Eden, who better than Christ to play the role of gardener king within it? The mistake of Mary Magdalene in thinking Jesus was literally the garden caretaker hints at a spiritual truth. Jesus is the caretaker of the paradise of resurrection, the one who defeated death and now offers the fruit of the tree of life to humanity once for all. In Christian theology, the cross itself came to be poetically identified with the tree of life. an instrument of death transformed into a source of eternal life. Thus, some early Christian hymns call the cross the fruitful tree, on which hung the second Adam who nullified Adam's curse. Just as there was sacred union between Adam and Eve, and there was sacred union between Dumuzid and Inanna, Ishtar, and we see the Hebrew Bible constantly draw back from the ancient Mesopotamian eros gamos, the sacred marriage, the same can be said about Jesus, the Lamb, and his bride, the church, and the sacred marriage of the once for all. This idea that the New Testament is completely separated, segregated from the ancient cyclical cycle of the dying and rising, I think is ignorant and misses the broader motifs that are being reinterpreted as a final once-for-all image in a sacred marriage. You see, many modern scholars support this continuity between Mesopotamian traditions and biblical text. We've relied on Geo Wittengren's seminal study, which is part of a long line of research into sacred kingship. As early as the 1920s, S.H. Hook and others in the myth ritual school observed that the rituals of Israel, like enthronement psalms or temple imagery, have deep parallels with Babylonian and Canaanite cultic patterns. Thorkild Jacobson and Samuel Noah Kramer highlighted how creation and paradise myths in Sumer influenced Hebrew creation stories. More recently, scholars like John Walton and Mark S. Smith have argued that Genesis deliberately engages with ancient Near Eastern motifs, demythologizing them but also echoing them to communicate in a familiar cultural lexicon. For instance, Walton notes that in the Mesopotamian thought, a temple is a micro-Eden, and thus Genesis 2-3 can be read as describing Adam as the first priest placed in the cosmic temple garden, a role very much like a Mesopotamian temple gardener. Comparative religion expert Mircea Eliade also commented on the ubiquity of the world tree symbol, Axis Mundi, in many cultures, and how the Bible's use of a central life tree fits that archetype in a unique monotheistic way. It's crucial to note that pointing out these parallels does not diminish the Bible's value. Rather, it does enrich our understanding. The biblical authors were like musicians adapting an ancient melody to a new song with new lyrics. They took well-known images, a king watering a sacred tree, a paradise lost to men, a life-giving river, a dying and rising beloved, and wove them into this picture of Israel's relationship with its one God. Continuity is clear, but so is transformation. In the Bible, the tree of life becomes a reward for the righteous. Proverbs 3:18 calls wisdom a tree of life to those who embrace her. The water of life becomes an ethical metaphor. Justice rolls down like waters, says Amos 5:24. And the sacred marriage becomes the covenant between God and his people. In Hosea and Ezekiel, God is the husband and Israel the bride. The old motifs are inwardly moralized and theologized even as their outward form remains recognizable. Finally, the Bible's end. Revelation's vision closes the loop of history by reopening the gates of Eden. The cherubim with the fiery sword are no longer mentioned. Instead, we read, "Blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they may have the right to the tree of life and may enter the city by the gates." Revelation 22:14. Access to the primordial garden's bounty is restored through the Lamb, Christ, who is implicitly both the new gardener and the one who guides us to springs of living water. Revelation 7:17. In Eden, a river flowed out. In New Jerusalem, the river flows from the throne, subtle shift indicating that God and the Lamb are the source of life eternal. This fulfills a long trajectory of thought, from Enki's waters in Eridu, filling the land with abundance, to God and Zion being the fountain of life, Psalm 36:9, to Christ offering living water to the Samaritan woman, John 4:14, and proclaiming, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink," John 7:37. The ancient symbolism lives on, carrying new spiritual significance. From the dawn of civilization in Sumer to the closing pages of the Bible, the imagery of the king, the gardener, the tree of life, and the living waters forms an unbroken vine. Deeply rooted in human religious consciousness, the biblical authors living at the crossroads of Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Canaanite cultures did not write in a vacuum. They were heirs to a treasury of symbols and stories, and they repurposed that inheritance to express their vision of the divine human drama. In closing, we see that our exploration vindicates an old truth. Mythic symbols are the heritage of all humanity. The king in his garden tending the tree of life by flowing waters is an image that spoke to Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Canaanites, and finally to Israelites and the early Christians, each in their own dialect. I imagine we can cover the Greeks and Persians as well as many others. It's a reminder that different cultures often seek answers to the same deep questions. Questions of life, death, and destiny, using the language of myth. The Bible's authors were like skillful gardeners themselves. They transplanted venerable old symbols into the soil of Israel's faith, where those symbols blossomed with fresh meaning.